Paying interest on reserve balances is more significant than you think. By Scott Fullwiler. The offsetting nature of the Treasury security operations and interest payment on reserve balances. As a liability on the Fed's balance sheet, changes to the Treasury's account necessarily and, by definition, change the quantity of reserve balances circulating, ceteris paribus. That is, reserve balances increase whenever the Treasury spends and decrease whenever the Treasury receives a payment. Net daily flows to from the Treasury's account as credits, debits to bank reserve accounts are substantial and are regularly the largest and least predictable of all changes to the Fed's balance sheet. The Treasury has historically manipulated balances held in correspondent accounts at thousands of banks across the country, called Treasury Tax and Loan, therefore hereafter TT&L accounts, to offset net changes to its account and to thereby minimize the net impact upon reserve balances. From the logic of the Fed's balance sheet, absent Treasury transfers to and from these accounts to offset daily net flows to from the Treasury's account, the Fed itself would be required to carry out operations of the same size to accommodate the demand for reserve balances and achieve the FOMC's target. Indeed, during 1974 to 1977, there was no Treasury tax and loan system, and the Fed's daily operations became significantly more complicated as a result. To support the Fed's operations, Treasury tax and loan balances are called in to offset Treasury-induced modest and temporary net additions to reserve balances. Operationally, when larger or more permanent net additions to reserve balances are made by the Treasury, offsetting sales of bonds are used to drain the reserve balances. Treasury bond sales have thus been referred to as interest rate maintenance operations, since just as without the Treasury tax and loan system for smaller and short-term deficits, without them it would be necessary for the Fed itself to drain the same quantity of reserve balances through open market sales to support a non-zero federal funds rate target. Instead of the complexities of the Treasury tax and loan system and bond sales, the more direct and more efficient method of interest rate support would be for the Fed to simply pay interest on reserve balances. With interest-bearing reserve balances, IBRBs, absent offsetting Treasury or Fed operations to drain excess balances created by a deficit, the federal funds rate would simply settle at the rate paid on reserve balances. The nature of Treasury bond sales as offsetting interest rate support rather than finance would be obvious. While the private sector is offered an interest-bearing liability of the government in the presence of a deficit to support a non-zero interest rate target, this does not necessitate that the Treasury sells bonds. The actions are sometimes feared to undermine the independence of monetary policy by creating excess balances though with IBRBs replacing bond sales, the Fed's independence and ability to exogenously adjust the federal funds rate target would be uncompromised and would simply require increasing or decreasing the rate paid on IBRBs. Regardless of the quantity of excess balances, the federal funds rate would not fall below this rate and would continue to influence other rates in the economy via arbitrage, since banks use reserve balances to settle their customers' tax liabilities. Holders of deposits so desiring could convert to short-term private liabilities, just as they can now, the rates for which would be set primarily via arbitrage with the Fed's target. Long-term rates, just as now, would be largely dependent upon the current and expected future paths of short-term rates. Those desiring fixed instead of flexible rate investments, perhaps banks holding IBRBs, could do so through swaps that would be priced similarly. Without treasuries, government agency securities and swaps could emerge as benchmarks for pricing of private assets, as is increasingly the case already, and for which they are better suited than treasuries anyway. In sum, with a deficit, the transmission of monetary policy via IBRBs is identical to that with non-interest-bearing reserve balances, NIBRBs, and bond sales to drain excess balances. With IBRBs, all Treasury securities could eventually be replaced. The interest rate on the national debt would then be the rate paid on IBRBs. Treasury securities themselves are simply fixed-rate liabilities, and from the private sector's perspective, not functionally different from IBRBs aside from the flexible rate nature of the latter. Note that consideration for IBRBs demonstrates how interest on Treasury debt is determined. With IBRBs and no securities issued, the interest rate is the rate paid on IBRBs, where short-term securities are issued as above. These rates are set via arbitrage with the Fed's target. As longer maturities are issued, again, as above, these rates are set largely via arbitrage with the expected path of the Fed's target. The crowding out view of the loanable funds market is irrelevant. The rates on various types of Treasury debt are set by the current and expected paths of monetary policy, and according to liquidity premia on fixed-rate debt of increasing maturity. Since long-term rates are normally higher than short-term rates, total interest on the national debt would be significantly reduced if IBRBs eventually replaced Treasuries. Those, like the Treasury, fearful that IBRBs would replace seniorage income, neglect that this would be far outweighed by the reduction in total interest paid on a national debt increasingly held as IBRBs. Indeed, there is no inherent reason for Treasury liabilities to exist across the entire term structure except as support operations for longer-term rates. Mitchell and Mosler, 2002. Deficits unaccompanied by bond sales are disapprovingly labeled monetization, although there is no meaningful difference from when bonds are issued. A government deficit always creates net financial assets for the private sector. That is, when a deficit occurs, by definition, the total credits to recipient bank accounts due to government expenditures are greater than the total debits from bank accounts to pay taxes. Whether bonds are issued to drain excess balances has no effect upon the private sector's net financial assets. The bond purchaser replaces a bank liability with the bond, while her bank's liabilities and reserve balances are both debited. If the bond is sold directly to a bank, then the bond simply replaces reserve balances. Whether bonds are sold, the ability of banks to finance further private spending is unaffected by debiting reserve balances or deposits created through deficit spending. Recall that since loans create deposits, if there are willing, credit-worthy borrowers, then desired spending is financed in any event. For deficits, what matters for the determination of aggregate spending and inflation is not whether bonds are sold, but whether the deficit is too large given the private sector's desire to net save. To summarize, consideration of interest payment on reserve balances demonstrates that bond sales are offsetting interest rate maintenance operations, not financing operations. With IBRBs, eventually the entire national debt could be held exclusively as reserve balances. As Lerner, 1943, envisioned, Treasury bond sales would occur simply because the private sector desired Treasuries for use as collateral or as risk-free fixed-rate investments. With NIBRBs, all reserve balances except those necessary to settle payments are drained via security sales by either the Fed or the Treasury. Reserve requirements necessitate that some additional reserve balances be left in circulation. Thus, when a deficit is incurred, the quantity of bonds sold depends upon the method of interest rate maintenance. As the impacts upon the net financial assets of the private sector from replacing credited NIBRBs with an interest rate bond or simply crediting IBRBs at the outset are identical, it is arbitrary to refer to the former as financing and to the latter as monetization. While government spending might be limited as a result of self-imposed legislation or lack of public support, the federal government is not financially constrained, even where the Treasury issues bonds.